Hello, Hashi, and you might have seen my earlier videos, which are interviews with people interested in things like entrepreneurship and art and science. And I did one video which is just me giving a monologue. But this one is a bit different. I'm going to give a lecture adapted from this book of mine that I wrote. It's titled Life in the Market Ecosystem. And you might wonder why I'm doing this. Well, I want to explain my philosophic position. And you might have noticed I'm very interested in the ideas of Ayn Rand. So I want to talk about her ideas, which are called objectivism. And I consider myself an objectivist. But for the most part, though, it's not that I'm an objectivist first. It's not that I'm an objectivist who happens to be Stuart K. Hayashi. First, I'm Stuart K. Hayashi, and I happen to be an objectivist. So this YouTube channel is about things that I'm interested in. They don't have to relate directly to objectivism. So if one day you see another one of my videos talking about my appreciation for Godzilla movies, please don't say, hey, this isn't about objectivism. What does this have to do with objectivism? Well, I agree with rational egoism. Therefore, I'm not going to sacrifice myself for the cause of objectivism. Because the point of this YouTube channel is me. More specifically, I want to promote my books. I want to give interviews talking about my books, and I want to build confidence doing so. And I think that doing these videos help with that. And Toastmasters, the Club Toastmasters has been suggested to me, and that's a legitimate suggestion. I do want to try doing what I do on video this way. Now, I suppose that a lot of people would find this video more interesting if I had PowerPoint type slides or some other type of visual aid, such as cutting in funny memes from all over the internet as they talk. Unfortunately, I'm not very computer literate. There comes a day when I become more computer literate, where I learn how to edit, and I finally cave in and purchase some editing software. It might be the case that I redo this lecture and put a more sophisticated, engaging version. But for now, it's just me talking. Yeah, so you've been warned. So I want to talk about several things. I'm interested in Ayn Rand's ideas or in her philosophy. I'm also interested in a branch of science, a discipline that's relatively new. Well, actually, I should qualify that. I might do that later on. It's older than many people think. It's called evolutionary psychology. And the idea behind evolutionary psychology is that there are these institutions, people have specific emotional reactions, we have specific customs, and evolutionary psychologists say there's probably an explanation behind this that has to do with natural selection. This could be a consequence of natural selection, particularly something that happened in the Stone Age. Now, I think there's a lot of merit to this. For the record, I don't agree with every evolutionary psychologist about everything. I don't agree with every pet theory. Just because someone's an evolutionary psychologist and says that he or she has an explanation for something that happens today that is a consequence of natural selection, just because an evolutionary psychologist says it doesn't mean I'm going to agree with it. See, and I know that's a big problem when I try to talk with people about evolutionary psychology. They will give me this whole litany of evolutionary psychology essays they've come across that they think are just ridiculous, and they say, "Well, do you agree with this? Do you? Huh? If not, then you should concede that evolutionary psychology is just bunk." No, it's not that way at all. When I say that evolutionary psychology has merit, I mean the general approach is correct. By that I mean I don't agree with every conclusion of evolutionary psychologists. I do think the general thrust is correct. I mean the approach. What I mean is the idea that there are specific behaviors of people, specific emotional reactions they have, specific institutions we have that can be adequately explained as a consequence of natural selection. I'll give some examples. There's a big problem in our society called fat shaming, where a lot of people, they're very prejudiced. They see someone who's very, obese, and they make all sorts of assumptions. They think that person is lazy, and they're just horrified. They have this horrible visceral reaction, and they want to ridicule that. And why does this happen? Is this a consequence of culture alone? Is it a consequence of conditioning alone? And the most plausible answer is no. Probably at one time, someone had some visceral reaction that served as an impetus, whereby people had visceral reactions, emotional reactions that served as an impetus to them trying to stigmatize obesity, and say they want this to be discouraged. And so evolutionary psychologists have an explanation for this. They say this is a consequence of natural selection, and if you look back in the Stone Age, or even in pre-industrial times, you can see why there might have been some type of benefit to people having a negative reaction to people looking very significantly different from the norm. And often when you talk about these things, people misunderstand it. They say, they think that if you explain why a certain behavior is a consequence of natural selection, they think you're trying to rationalize people engaging in that behavior today. So if evolutionary psychologists say, well, there's people fat shaming is a consequence of natural selection, people will assume, well, you're saying people should engage in that right now because it's a good thing. And that's not the case at all. Just because something might has some type of benefit, even that word has to be qualified, because just because something furthers the selfish gene doesn't mean it's good for the individual. I'll get to that later. Just because something might have been helped propagate one's genes across generations doesn't follow that it's a good thing, or even that it's a type of behavior in our present day and age that can propagate your genes to a full extent. We see just because a behavior, isn't something we should engage in right now, doesn't mean that, there isn't some evolutionary basis in it. It doesn't mean that at one time, it doesn't preclude the possibility that at some time in the Stone Age, people engaging in that behavior might have led them to be more successful in propagating their genes across generations than they otherwise would have. The same principle goes along with, like, say, sexual jealousy. Now, sexual jealousy usually has very bad consequences, especially when people act on it. Okay, people get very violent because of sexual jealousy. Now, why is this? Is it a consequence of brainwashing? Is it just only because our culture has been brainwashed to have sexual jealousy? It's very unlikely. If everyone in our society was lectured about how bad sexual jealousy is and how we should just not have sexual jealousy, that would probably not be sufficient enough to stop people from getting sexually jealous. It wouldn't stop some men from thinking, oh no, these other guys are hitting on my girlfriend, I have to stop this. it was very likely that sexual jealousy emerged in the Stone Age or even earlier, because the men who were very sexually jealous, gave them it increased the men who are sexually jealous and increased the likelihood of being successful in propagating their genes across generations. They wanted to stop other guys propagating their genes. They had to make sure they were the ones propagating their genes, and that they weren't raising, other men's biological children. And again, it doesn't follow just because if we concede that sexual jealousy is a consequence of natural selection, evolutionary psychologists are correct in their explanation about this. It doesn't follow that, in our modern day and age, people should act on their sexual jealousy. That's a completely different matter. And I'm going to explain why. Just because something might have helped people propagate their genes across generations thousands of years ago, it doesn't mean that that still provides an evolutionary advantage in our present time. The reason why I bring this up is that I noticed that my fellow objectivists often get into big arguments with evolutionary psychologists. And sometimes there are some areas where I agree with one side over the other. And I find there's a lot of misunderstanding. But there are several reasons for this. Often, many evolutionary psychologists, they have a very caricatured idea of what objectivism is, especially Ayn Rand's idea of ethical egoism. An example would be David Sloan Wilson. He purports to refute objectivism. He says, in a market economy, people benefit when people in a market economy, most advantageous thing is not for you to work only for your own self-interest and never benefit anyone else. He said it's better when people cooperate with one another and have mutual trust. This is the invisible band, which accompanies Adam Smith's invisible hand. And he says, well, see, in the market economy, people benefit from cooperating. Therefore, I disproved Ayn Rand's theory of ethical egoism. That's a straw man. Nothing in Ayn Rand's theory of ethical egoism precludes cooperation. In fact, Ayn Rand encourages cooperation when she talks about people being traders. In case you haven't noticed, when a vendor and a consumer make a trade, they are cooperating with one another. And each does it to his or her own self-interest. People cooperate and the reason for cooperating is that they ascertain that serves their self-interest. So pointing out that people benefit from cooperation doesn't refute Ayn Rand's ethical theory. And if David Sloan Wilson bothered to read Ayn Rand's writings in context, instead of just make assumptions, he would probably deliver a much more coherent argument. So I find evolutionary psychologists frequently misunderstand objectivism. And in David Sloan Wilson's case, a lot of it is because of a type of intellectual laziness, and seeing what he wants to see, rather than trying to understand Ayn Rand on her own terms. Now, sometimes the misunderstanding is mutual, and especially in cases having to do with semantics, such as the use of the term altruism. But Ayn Rand says that that the basis of ethical behavior should not be altruism. Altruism is not synonymous with moral behavior. And when she uses the term altruism, she uses the word same way as the philosopher who coined the term, Auguste Comte. He's French and coined the term in the 1800s. Of course, in our modern times, people tend to use the word altruism very differently. They think it doesn't mean exclusively the subordination of your own interest to that of some other entity. They think altruism just means being generous, being nice to people. Anything you do that's beneficial to other people is altruism, they assume. That when people use that term that way, that's largely a consequence of the philosopher Herbert Spencer, who knew a friend of John Stuart Mill's, rather deliberately trying to change the definition of altruism. But anyway, often evolutionary psychologists say, therefore, altruism, they mean they like anything that's beneficial. Anytime you do something that's beneficial, they think that's altruism. So what happens is something like this. An objectivist will say, well, I don't think altruism is really moral. And evolutionary psychologist hears that and assumes that objectivists are against benefiting anyone other than themselves. And so evolutionary psychologists go to the objectivists and say, well, you're stupid because it's good to cooperate with other people. So altruism is good. So often objectivists and evolutionary psychologists talk past each other that way. Once in a while, both sides do end up explaining what their side means by altruism. But even then, there are barriers to mutual understanding. Often the argument comes down to, no, my definition of altruism is correct and yours is wrong. And so often on the internet, places like Facebook, people will spend hours arguing. Objectivists and evolutionary psychologists will argue for hours over saying, my definition of altruism is right and yours is wrong. And they won't even get past that and explore other avenues, other aspects of this. And that's very unfortunate. I think that the correct approach is just to both sides to accept each side means one thing by altruism, and if you don't want to concede the other side's use of the term, you come up with another word, So that's another big barrier. And I have to admit that my fellow objectivists misunderstand evolutionary psychology as well, and this is a common misunderstanding common to pretty much most people who are not evolutionary psychologists. So the rebuttal to evolutionary psychology goes something like this. Well, evolutionary psychologists are genetic determinists. They assume everything that happens is a consequence of your genes. You're genetically programmed to play video games. You're genetically programmed to watch TV. And no, that's not the case at all. A lot of these behaviors are influenced by culture. These are human institutions that are not genetically programmed from birth. They're taught. I point out that also these customs are not just taught. Someone sometime had to invent them. But not even evolutionary psychologists. Hardly anyone talks about that. Hardly anyone talks about the fact that stuff has to be, these art institutions have to be invented, because people are stuck in this false dichotomy of nature versus nurture. That's another something to get into. But anyway, people say to evolutionary psychologists, not everything is genetically predetermined. We have culture too. There are customs that are learned, and people learn them through conditioning. So you're totally wrong. And another rebuttal was something like this. Well, evolutionary psychologists say that altruism is a consequence of natural selection, correct? Self-sacrifice is an idea. When someone sacrifices him or herself, the psychology behind that is consequence of natural selection, right? Well, if that's consequence of evolution, then why isn't everyone self-sacrificial then? Why do you have to tell people self-sacrifice is good? The very fact that you're trying to teach people that self-sacrifice is good proves that altruism, or this notion that self-sacrifice is good, is not genetically predetermined. It's not inborn. So you're refuted. Ha! Okay, there are problems with that. Those two rebuttals are straw men. Evolutionary psychology is not genetic determinism. Evolutionary psychologists do recognize that there are customs that we have that are not genetically predetermined, but are a consequence of culture, that people learn them through conditioning. And acknowledging that doesn't actually, evolutionary psychology doesn't preclude all of that. Actually, evolutionary psychology incorporates that consideration in the idea of gene-culture coevolution, and that's what I want to discuss. Moreover, when evolutionary psychologists say that they think altruism is a consequence of natural selection, they're being correct. If they are correct on that issue, their being correct does not require every single person to be genetically programmed to be altruistic, because the idea is that there's variation, there's genetic variation. Genetically, people are different. Even two siblings are not genetically identical unless they're identical twins. So you can have a mix of genes, and if it's true that some people can be on some genetic basis be more altruistic than others, it's the case that even if this is affected by genes, the fact that there's genetic variations means genetically one person might be more genetically predisposed toward altruism than someone else, even more so than his or her siblings. So, saying that the fact that not everyone is altruistic disproves evolutionary psychology is not an adequate rebuttal. But evolutionary psychologists do often argue that not every single person is genetically predetermined to be altruistic. That is not congenital. But there is something they do argue is congenital, and that is what I will contest in this video or a future video. But they believe what is congenital is that when you look in every society, every culture, especially hunter-gatherer societies, the norm will be for people to be more impressed by someone who sacrifices him or herself for society. They'll be more impressed by that than someone who peaceably looks out for his or her own self-interest and makes no sacrifices. The former behavior will always be more impressive to most people than the latter behavior, even if the latter behavior also benefits everyone else in that society. All hunter-gatherer societies think that way, meaning not every hunter-gatherer in every society is like that, but what is you do find uniformly is that conception of morality is the norm. Therefore, altruistic behavior is not congenital, but what evolutionary psychologists argue that what is congenital is the notion of altruism being more moral than peaceable self-interest. The notion that peaceable self-interest is inferior to collectivist self-sacrifice, this idea of morality is the norm in societies, and this being the norm is congenital, according to evolutionary psychologists. So, if my fellow objectivists and I want to rebut the evolutionary psychologists' claim to have refuted objectivism, that is the argument we have to address. And we also have to address gene-culture coevolution and the idea behind kin selection. And actually, kin selection, I think, is a valid idea. I think there's lots of evidence for it. So, so there's a big problem with just being dismissive toward everything in evolutionary psychology. Because even if evolutionary psychologists are wrong about a lot of things, and I think they're wrong to claim they've refuted objectivist ethics, just because they're wrong about a lot of things, it doesn't mean that we benefit from dismissing everything they say. Because I think we can learn a lot from them, and the idea of kin selection is one of those things. And I'm going to explain how kin selection can be a valid idea and actually not be the refutation of objectivist ethics that many evolutionary psychologists assume that it is. So I'm going to give a big long argument, and is adapted from my book, Life in the Market Ecosystem. And this video is not a replacement for this book. I cite my sources much more thoroughly in this book, and for reasons you can imagine. And also, in this video, I won't be able to address every possible rebuttal, every possible counter argument. You know, people can say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? You didn't address it in your video. But just because I don't address it in this video, it doesn't mean I haven't considered it. And it doesn't mean I haven't addressed it elsewhere. It could also be addressed in this book. Not even the book can address everything, every possible objection. As you can see, it's too short. But I do want to be clear that just because something is not explained in this video, it doesn't mean that I have never explained it everywhere, period. You might find the answer in my book. So first I want to explain what gene-culture coevolution is. And this is what distinguishes evolutionary psychology from, say, eugenics or genetic determinism. But the idea is this. We have made customs in our society, you know, business practices, institutions like marriage, you know, we have rituals, things like religion, you know, all these religious rituals, you know, like Catholic Mass, communion wafers, you know, folk dances, and even forms of recreation like, you know, football. Doesn't matter if American and European, you know, football, and philosophic ideas, including political philosophy, you know, objectivism, Marxism, you know, pragmatism, Republicans, Democrats, welfare state, privatization, existentialism. All of these are institutions or customs. When I say custom, I mean this is something that is not genetically predetermined, but is a part of human society, and it can be propagated, transmitted from one generation to the next through conditioning. That is, you know, I'm not necessarily born a Marxist, but I can still transmit it to future generations by going around trying to teach people Marxism, trying to proselytize about Marxism. See, and if I succeed in proselytizing from Marxism, it gets spread from one generation to the next. Okay, so these ideas or customs that can be spread from one generation to the next are what William Graham Sumner called folkways. For the purpose, I'm going to say custom. And evolutionary psychologists fully acknowledge that these are not genetically predetermined. You're not born with them. They recognize that these are taught through conditioning. They come from experience. They come from people trying to influence you in your environment. Evolutionary psychologists should also mention that these customs are invented. Sometimes someone had to invent the idea. There was a time when there were no Christmas trees. I mean, there was no institution of some people cutting down this pine tree and putting it in their home and using it in some ritual to celebrate. Some weird person had to originate that at some time. So these customs are invented, and then if they persist throughout the culture, it's because you taught from one generation to the next. And this idea of gene culture coevolution, since the 1970s, the idea has been discussed, propagated mostly by Charles Lumsden and Edward O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson's authored the book Sociobiology, and he's very environmentalist. You know, he talks on and on about how humans are causing the extinction of other species. And I think Bjorn Lomborg gives good rebuttal to E.O. Wilson about that. It shows E.O. Wilson exaggerates a lot, has an exaggerated notion of the extent to which humans are causing species extinction. But I think E.O. Wilson has many good points about gene culture coevolution. Okay, so we have these customs. And the basic idea is that these customs, although they're not genetically predetermined, they still count as evolutionary adaptations because they can still influence your likelihood of being able to have children and raise your children so that they grow up and have their own children. Whether or not the customs you practice can make or break whether or not you have kids and grandkids. Like say, like let's say we have two identical twin brothers, okay? They have the same genes and they're raised in the same environment, but for some reason they turn out with very different personalities. We'll have sober twin and drunk twin. Okay. Drunk twin, for some reason, sober twin just abstains from alcohol, and for some reason, a drunk twin drinks a lot of alcohol and he drunk drives. So drunk twin, when he's 17 years old, he drunk drives and dies and never has kids. By contrast, a sober twin, he drives a lot, but he doesn't drunk drive. He stays away from alcohol. He does live long enough to have children. Moreover, he also raises those children so they grow up and have their own children. Now, whether or not you drunk drive is not genetically predetermined. Some people have are more genetically vulnerable to alcoholism than others, but I don't think drunk driving is genetically determined. Nevertheless, whether or not you drunk drive can influence your ability to propagate your genes across generations. And note also that the person's, if practicing a specific custom helps you spread your genes to have future generations, so you have kids and grandkids, note also that likely you're going to try to instill that same custom to your kids and grandkids. See, so it says even though the custom is not genetically predetermined, notice how it can persist from one generation to the next in a manner similar to a genetically predetermined adaptation. Like, let's say I don't drunk drive, I abstain from drunk driving, I have kids and then grandkids, and then I make sure to teach them not to drunk drive either. So even though that's not genetically predetermined, the custom helping me survive and have kids and spread my genes also makes it likelier for me to spread that very same custom to future generations. So a custom can be, even though there's no guarantee someone will adopt the customs of his parents, his or her parents or grandparents, like a custom helping someone have kids and grandkids makes it likelier of that custom being propagated from one generation to the next. That's why Lumsden and E.O. Wilson argue that a custom can count as an evolutionary adaptation, even though that custom is not genetically predetermined. Because if the custom can influence the likelihood of people having kids and grandkids, then the custom not only helps people propagate their genes across generations, but if the custom helps people in a specific environment, adapt to a specific environment, then the custom itself can will be perpetuated. But I want to be clear that, well, I want to be clear about several things. First, just because a custom helps people adapt to one environment doesn't mean the custom will always be adaptive. It will always help them. Sometimes practicing the custom might help people have kids and grandkids in a particular time and a particular environment, both geographic environment, like natural, both natural environment and human-made social cultural environment. Sometimes it can be beneficial in that time and place, but if society changes a lot and changes the landscape, there might come a point where the practicing a custom no longer helps people propagate their genes the way it once did. Also, something else I want to be clear about is that although lots of people think E.O. Wilson and Charles Lumsden came up with the idea, actually, the sociologist William Graham Sumner argued something very similar in 1906 in his book Folkways. And sadly, he doesn't really get credit for that. And a lot of this credit is denied to him as a consequence of evolutionary psychologists. Reason is that since 1940s, Richard Hofstadter smeared William Graham Sumner and Herbert Spencer as social Darwinists. And he made this huge straw man argument against Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, falsely equivocating them with eugenics, equivocating them with racism, racial discrimination, imperialism, all those things that they actually never argued for. And even though the impression is inaccurate, negative stigma stuck. And eventually there came a point where people started judging Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner as bad guys without ever having to have bothered to read their books cover to cover. And that includes academicians, many academics in the social sciences, all the sciences really, except maybe people who study Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner directly. Except for those who study them directly, pretty much people in all sciences think they know what Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner said when they're really just going by the misrepresentation from Richard Hofstadter. And there was some nuance in Richard Hofstadter's evaluation of them. Sometimes he admitted, well, in this context, William Graham Sumner is arguing against imperialism, things like that. But what happened was other academicians like John Kenneth Galbraith took Richard Hofstadter's false evaluation of Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner and just ran with it and took the basic gist of it. It got rid of all the nuances, and John Kenneth Galbraith spread this whole thing about Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner being social Darwinists and how, if you read Folkways, it will turn you into a social Darwinist eugenicist who wants poor people to die. And that got really ingrained in social sciences. So evolutionary psychologists have become very, not all of them, some of them are aware of this, but many of them, such as Sarah Blacker Hardy, they just boss into secondhand descriptions of what Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner said. They said, oh, and then they got very much offended when people accused evolutionary psychology of being the same thing as social Darwinism. So people told E.O. Wilson and Sarah Blacker Hardy, oh, you're reviving social Darwinism with your sociobiology. And then E.O. Wilson rebutted, no, I'm not a bigot. I'm not a eugenicist. I'm not right-wing. Therefore, I disavow Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner and John D. Rockefeller and all the rest, because I'm not a bigot. So I'd come up with something new, like sociobiology and gene culture coevolution, which is distinct from what those more primitive people argued. But if he bothered to read Folkways cover to cover before he said that, I think you would have to concede that actually Folkways anticipates a lot of what he and Charles Lumsden talked about when he described it, gene culture coevolution. But anyway, so first I'm going to explain what the evolutionary psychology argument is. I mean, what beef evolutionary psychology has with objectivism, and why evolutionary psychologists think they have refuted Ayn Rand's ethics of peaceable egoism, peaceable self-interest. And we talk about kin selection, and why they think kin selection is sort of this trump card that refutes objectivism. I want to explain why kin selection actually is a valid idea, and why even though his selection is a valid idea, that's not sufficient to refute the objectivist ethics. Then I want to explain how, if you take gene culture coevolution theory to its logical conclusion, you would have to, I think you would have to concede that Ayn Rand's ethical theory is not just another folkway, another custom, another evolutionary adaptation, but one that, insofar as it has been practiced, has demonstrable results, showing that it has helped people propagate their genes and customs across generations. Even though no one's a perfect, even though you won't find entrepreneurs who are perfect objectivists, objectivists are very rare. But to the degree that entrepreneurs, even though they're not explicit objectivists, to the degree that they practice something like Ayn Rand's ethical egoism, you see how they have helped themselves and other people increase their likelihood of having kids and grandkids and reducing the child mortality rate and all of that. And actually helping other people have, helping people not related to you and having kids and grandkids, helping other people who aren't your relatives having kids and grandkids. Neither objectivist ethics or gene culture coevolution precludes any of that. Actually, evolutionary psychology has an explanation for why you do feel good if you help people who are not genetically related to you. That's something to get into too. There's a lot to get into. So I want to, first part is I'm going to give the evolutionary psychology case, then I'm going to give my case of why the evolutionary psychology case does not refute the objectivist ethics. So if you take their gene culture idea of gene culture coevolution to its logical conclusion, you should give Ayn Rand ethics should be on the table. It is up for consideration. It is a possible model for how in our present political system, our present environment that we have created for ourselves, it is a possible way, a custom that possibly helps people propagate their genes and customs throughout across generations. And that's the case, even though I don't think that I don't think that the justification for the objectivist ethics or Ayn Rand or any of that, I don't think the justification is, well, it helps people propagate their genes and customs across generations. I'm not saying that's the justification. I agree with Harry Binswanger's argument for the objectivist ethics. He argues that in this book, I still agree with it. So when I say that objectivist ethics helps you propagate your genes and customs across generations, I'm not saying that that's the justification, and I'm abandoning, objectivist idea that you have a right to live for your own sake, even if you don't have kids. You have a right to live for your own sake. I'm not abandoning that. I'm just pointing out that living for your own sake in the Ayn Randian sort of way doesn't actually conflict with this notion of having kids and grandkids and propagating your genes across and customs across generations. Those are not in conflict. One does not preclude the other. All right. So first, the evolutionary psychology argument. They go by, it relies upon Richard Dawkins' theory of the selfish gene. And again, this is another thing people have a lot of assumptions about when they hear selfish gene. They think, Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The Selfish Gene. That means he wrote a book arguing that everyone is selfish. Well, not everyone is selfish. Some people are generous. Some people are kind. Therefore, Richard Dawkins is wrong. No, that's not his argument. Actually, Richard Dawkins' argument in many ways is an argument in favor of altruism. In some ways, I think it's a rationalization for altruism. First, I should say what Richard Dawkins means by selfish. He's going by the conventional idea Selfish means you only care about you, and you're willing to sacrifice other people for your own benefit. In this case, it's a metaphor. The gene isn't literally selfish. A sapient organism can be selfish. Okay, but the genes themselves are just part of the organism. The genes themselves are not selfish any more than a strand of hair is selfish or a toenail clipping is selfish. But the basic idea goes like this: the genes feel chemical reactions, and what happens is what determines whether or not, what goes like this: the gene, if we pretend the gene is a person with a personality, the gene doesn't program its host, the organism, always to satisfy its own self-interest, not even its long-term self-interest. The gene doesn't necessarily program the organism to survive for as long as possible or to have the maximum amount of comfort as possible. Sometimes the gene programs the organism to look out for its self-interest only to the degree that it increases the likelihood of the gene being transmitted across generations, not merely to the next generation, but to the generation after that. And once the genetic legacy is secure, once there's a strong likelihood that the gene has been passed on and will be passed on yet again and again and again, once that has been secured, the organism itself, as far as the genes are concerned, is expendable. And you can give the example of praying mantises in captivity, although that example is misleading. Probably a better example is the scientist Karen Bondard's example of spiders. I'll give the example of praying mantises first. Okay, so let's say genes program the behavior of the praying mantis. And remember, there's genetic diversity, there's a variety, therefore genes can program some praying mantises to be one way, and then maybe other genes, dominant or recessive, will program praying mantises to behave another way. So let's say we have two male praying mantises, egoist and altruist. Egoist is programmed by his genes always to seek out his own survival. But conversely, altruist is also programmed by his genes. They're both males. And altruist, because of his genes and his programming, he will not always necessarily seek out his own survival. So let's say it's time for them to mate. If male praying mantis mates with the female, she will eat him and kill him. He'll spread his genes, but she'll kill him. Since he always looks out for his own self-interest, he doesn't mate at all. As a consequence, he doesn't mate anyone, so he dies alone. If he bothered to have if he had kids, he could pass on his genes that program selfish behavior into future generations. But since he doesn't mate to begin with, he's not going to do that. Conversely, let's say altruist, because he's not programmed always to look out for his own self-interest, his own survival, he does mate with the female. And in so doing, he propagates his genes, including genes that program altruistic behavior. So his male offspring will be like him. They will also risk their own lives to mate. And then altruist gets eaten and he dies. So even though altruist isn't being altruistic, even though altruist isn't being selfish, note that Richard Dawkins says the gene is selfish. Altruist genes selfishly perpetuate themselves at the expense of the male organism, whom the gene sacrificed. So over time, male praying mantises who have genes that make them selfish, like egoist, they dwindle in number until they go extinct. And it's the ones who are like altruist males who are like altruists, who perpetuate cross generations. They become the dominant ones. Now, the example is misleading because actually the notion that the female always eats the male is likely a myth. The female eating the male after mating has been observed in captivity, but I've been reading scientists saying that when you study praying mantises in the wild, that doesn't always happen. But here's an example of something that does happen in the wild, and scientist Karen Vondar talks about it in a YouTube video. And she talks about a species of spiders where the females are much larger than the males, and the females are cannibalistic. So there's a problem. When males approach the females to mate, there's always a risk that they're going to be eaten by the females, and many of them are. Some of them do survive though. But let's say merely taking the risk of possibly the male simply taking the risk of possibly being eaten is a kind of self-sacrifice. So again, let's say we have one male, egoist and altruist. Egoist won't won't take any risks of his life in order to mate. Conversely, altruist will risk his life in order to mate, even though that increases the likelihood of him dying. Well, in that case, male spiders who are like egoists won't mate at all, so they don't. So even though they have genes programming them to be self-interested as individuals, they're not going to properly transmit those genes to the future generations. That germline will be discontinued and they die off. Conversely, let's look at guys who are like altruists, and there are many of them who are like altruists. Many of them actually do get eaten by the female, but what about the ones who succeed in mating with the female? What happens to them? Well, they spread their genes to future generations, and their offspring will include males who have the genes that program them to be altruistic, hence the selfish gene. Okay, so that's one part. Now we get to kin selection. And a common misunderstanding of evolution and natural selection is that it's always competition of one individual against another individual. It's always I, myself, me alone, I should spread my genes, I should get to mate, and to the degree that anybody else interferes with my ability as an individual to mate, they're my enemies. Okay, it's about me. If it's a zero-sum game and other guys getting mate means I have less of an opportunity to mate, then I have to look out for myself at the expense of the other guys. See, actually, natural selection is not always like that. There's such a thing called kin selection. And under kin selection, the competition is not individual versus individual, it's family unit versus family unit. And even if one individual in the family does not actually mate, and does not have offspring, that individual who never got to mate can still perpetuate his or her own genetic material by performing some type of behavior that increases the likelihood of some other members of the family being better able to transmit their genes to future generations. And you see this type of behavior with insect colonies, like bees, termites, ants. Let's consider worker ants and soldier ants. All of them are female. Not just that, they're born sterile. They're never going to have babies. The only female that lays eggs and they're fertile and that hatch is the queen. And of course, eventually the queen lays all the eggs. Is responsible for the drones, male drones, for the female workers, female soldiers, and ultimately the next queen. But so the queen mates with the male drone, but the workers they don't mate. Does this mean that they're failures? Does this mean that they're genetic failures? That since birth they don't contribute to evolution at all? They don't contribute to the perpetuation of their own genes? No, they do, because in their actions, they dig tunnels, they search for food. To the degree that they succeed at this, they help keep the drones and the queen alive long enough so that the queen lays more eggs that hatches another queen. And then so if you're a worker, so let's pretend you're a worker ant and you do all the worker ant things, and your work contributes to queen eventually laying eggs and resulting in the next queen that will lay more eggs. If you have contributed to that, even though you yourself never mated and never laid eggs, you have contributed to another generation having genes very similar to your own. And that's kin selection. And humans are obviously not a hive. We're not like a beehive, and thank goodness for that. But kin selection did happen with Stone Age people. I want to explain that. Oh yeah, you might wonder why. What's so good about kin selection? Like you might say, well, okay, so maybe your behavior helps other, even though you haven't had kids, your behavior helps other people in your family have kids and raise those kids so that their kids, so that those kids grow up and have kids of their own. Okay, sure, but how is it? But wouldn't you rather have your own kids? Because then your kids will be more closely genetically related to you. So don't you want to maximize? So don't you want to maximize in the next generation? You want the next generation? Don't you want to maximize the likelihood that the next generation has as much of your own genetic material as possible? So doesn't that refute kin selection? It doesn't, because frankly, when in sexual reproduction, you can't perfectly propagate all of your genes from one generation to another in sexual reproduction, because anytime you reproduce sexually, your offspring don't have all of your DNA. They only have a fraction of, they only have some of your DNA, genetic material. If you wanted to be 100% successful in propagating all of your genes to the next generation, you would have to clone yourself. It would have to be asexual. You'd have to produce an exact clone of yourself. And there are animals that do that. And there's a reason why sexual reproduction started. But well, there's several reasons. First, there were single-celled organisms, and they reproduce asexually by splitting. And basically, every time the single-celled organism splits into two cells, each is supposed to be a perfect copy, right? They're supposed to be perfect. But there are many environmental factors that fought against this perfection. First of all, chemical damage. Oxygen damages, too much oxygen damages cellular tissue. We need oxygen to breathe, and we need oxygen to live. But actually, if you have too high a dosage of it, it will damage your tissue. And the same thing with radiation. Truth is, we need some radiation to live, but too much radiation is going to damage your cells. So when they're single-celled organisms, eventually they suffered damage to their tissue from oxygen and radiation. And there's another problem that was viruses. Viruses are not exactly like single-celled organisms. They're simpler. They're in this they're chemical reactions, they're chemical proteins, but they're in this gray area where between inanimate object and organism, because viruses take on traits that are very similar to what scientists call organisms, but not exactly. You know, a virus doesn't really have a cell. It doesn't have all the parts that we would say constitute a cellular organism. But anyway, viruses also make are able to destroy single-celled organisms. So there had to be so eventually that was a problem, but something happened. Eventually, a mutation occurred with single-cell organisms. Could have been caused by radiation, could be caused by something else in the environment, but somehow a mutation happened that started a sexual reproduction in organisms. And basically, two organisms would cross paths, and they would exchange genetic material and produce an offspring that has material from both of the organisms. In that case, if you reproduce sexually, you don't propagate all of your genetic material, you only propagate a fraction of it. But that's better than just dying and not being able to transmit any genetic material at all, right? So that became one avenue. And for a long time, many organisms could do it both. Many organisms can reproduce sexually or asexually, like plants. If you take a cutting of a plant and plant it, you know, you'll get another one that's a clone of the original. But plants also fertilize one another too, that's sexual. That happens with animals like slugs or hermaphrodites. So, you know, they can produce sexually or asexually. Even some types of lizards can clone themselves. So, you know, but anyway, somehow with mammals, we reached a point where we reproduce sexually. If you know, I'm in favor. If you can do it safely, I think it should be legal for you to make a clone of yourself, and raise that clone as your child. I think that should be legal, but that's another controversy for another day. But anyway, the point is that in the normal natural world, if you reproduce sexually, inevitably you can't spread all of your genes. You have to settle for just some of your genetic material going from one generation to the next. So I don't think it's a big leap to say, well, even if you don't have kids, if you help your siblings or your other relatives have kids, if you help them raise their kids and their kids grow up and become adults and have kids, you're still propagating your genes because you share some genes with all those other people. So I don't think it's a big leap to go from you know, sexual reproduction to being satisfied with relatives sharing some of your genes, having kids, and then their kids having kids. So I want to talk about, now I'm going to get to humans. Okay, so notice with humans, it's not sufficient just for people to, in the case of natural selection, it's not sufficient just to have kids. You have to make sure your kids are also able to become adults and have kids of their own. That has to happen if you want your genes passed from one generation to the next. Like, let's say we have two couples. Again, they're genetically programmed to behave a certain way. We have a negligent couple or nurturing couple, and nurturing couple. So negligent couple, they're both genetically predetermined just to have sex, and then when they have kids, they'll just after they have kids to them, that's the end of it. So okay, so the wife gives birth, and then gives birth to babies, and then they say, okay, we're done we're done. We're not going to coddle you. We want you to be tough. So we're going to toss you off into the cruel world, and you'll have to fend for yourself, because they're Republicans. So what happens if negligent couple does that? So they have kids, have sex, and then they have kids. They give birth to babies and then just leave them lying around. Well, the babies are going to die before they get old enough to have kids of their own. So they're not going to propagate to the next generation whatever those genes for being negligent parents. Now let's look at a nurturing couple. So nurturing couple is genetically predetermined to have affection for babies, and so they have sex, and then they have babies, and for them that's not the end of it. They look at the babies and go, "Aww," and they take care of the babies because the babies are so vulnerable, and they raise babies to adulthood. So the babies grow up, become adults, and now they're sexually mature. They have kids of their own. See, if that happens, then the baby's a nurturing couple will have the same genes that make them want to be nurturing parents, and then they, because they were raised to adulthood, they go off and pair up and have their own kids and then pass on the same genes. So you see how eventually, to the extent that genes might influence people to be negligent parents who never take care of the kids, those genes are a dead end. They die off. And eventually the majority become people who are genetically programmed to, once they have kids, to raise them. And again, you might think I'm sounding like a genetic determinist. No, no. I know that some people are like Casey Anthony, allegedly. Some people are like Casey Anthony, where they don't want to they have kids and then they don't raise them. You see, the examples like that don't preclude the evolutionary psychology argument, because they're talking about norms. You know, they account for variation among people. They say, you know, according to what adaptation helps people spread their genes. Some are genes, some adaptations will become more plentiful than others, and others are just dead ends that will die out. But anyway, there's a reason why, if you want, there's a reason why if you want your babies to become strong adults, you have to raise them, or someone has to raise them. But it has to do with brain size, and that's another thing we're going to get into. Oh, I also want to explain why lots of people are adoptive parents. They adopt children and they raise them as their own, and they love their adopted children no less strongly than than they would have if the kids were their own genetically. That doesn't actually contradict evolutionary psychology either. Evolutionary psychology does have an explanation for why people love adopted children. It's similar to the explanation of why feeling good about helping people who are not related to you doesn't conflict with evolutionary psychology either. So I have to get to that. But anyway, what happened was, the humans' brains kept getting bigger and bigger, and this actually relates to my later explanation of how objectivism is not refuted. It's not refuted by kin selection or Stone Age hunter-gatherers being collectivists or any of that. And it starts with the brains getting bigger and bigger. But anyway, what happened was, among our hominid ancestors, the brains kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it got to a point where it was actually hazardous to the health of many mothers trying to give birth. There came a point where the fetus's head was so big it couldn't fit through the birth canal. And lots of in those cases where the fetus's head was so big it couldn't fit through the birth canal, the fetus died, and probably the mother died too. So let's say, there had to be a way around this, and there was. So let's say we have one mother pregnant mother. We have two pregnant mothers, but genetically they're different. We have long gestation mother. She's genetically programmed to just gestate the fetus for a long time, not give birth prematurely, and we're going to have a premature birth mother. For some reason, genes program her to give birth to the fetus prematurely. It can't be too premature because that would be dangerous, but premature at a point where maybe the fetus can still survive even though it's born prematurely. Okay, let's say we have those two. Long gestation mother is norm at the moment, but she's not, because the fetus head is so big. The fetus, she doesn't have any kids that survive, so she's not able to pass along the genes both for the big brains and for the long gestation period. So her germline is dead end. That side dies off. What about a premature birth mother? What happens is she gives, because of her genes programming her to do so, she gives birth to her babies prematurely. What happens is, as a consequence, the brain isn't fully formed yet. It's still soft, so it fits through the birth canal. So the fetus survives mother and the fetus both survive childbirth. What happens is, so what happens is, though that's the line, that's not a dead end, they survive. But of course, you might notice that that's not good enough. So let's say there are two premature birth-giving mothers, but they have another distinction between them. Again, premature birth-giving mother who is negligent, and premature birth-giving mother who is nurturing. Okay, premature birth-giving mother who is negligent, again, like our previous negligent parents example, she gives birth to the fetus prematurely, it survives childbirth, but she doesn't take care of it, it dies. The thing is that because the baby is born prematurely and its brain isn't fully developed yet, as a consequence of that, it's very extremely vulnerable. It can't fend for itself. And that's why it needs to be protected by the parents. So if it's just left to fend for itself, it's going to die, and it's not going to propagate its genes. It's not going to propagate its parents' genes. But what if we have a premature birth-giving mother who is also nurturing? Okay, so she's programmed by her genes both to give birth to the fetus before the brain is fully developed, and she's programmed by her genes to be very nurturing toward the baby once it's born. She's going to be the one to pass on her genes to the next generation. Hence, that's why to this day, it's good for parents to raise their kids until their kids are grown up and have kids of their own. Okay. Okay, so now I have to get back to kin selection. Okay, so here's the deal with kin selection and the Stone Age. We have this, lots of philosophers from the Renaissance who started talking about social contracts, like Thomas Hobbes, were under this false impression that cavemen, like ancient men, were solitary. Either they really thought this, or they just imagined it this way for their thought experiments. But either way, in their thought experiment, in their social contract thought experiment, they said, well, first man was all alone. People were like wandering recluses, all separate. And eventually they all banded together and formed society. The opposite is true. Okay. Back in the Stone Age, there weren't wandering reclusive men or women, because our ancestors were already very group oriented. Okay, we descended from primates that were already living in groups, what I would call societies. You could quibble with that and say that's being too anthropomorphic. But basically, apes live in society. Great apes live in societies. That's how our ancestors was. That's the way the common ancestor of humans and chimps were. You can still see chimps and bonobos living in societies, groups. Okay, in the case of humans, we're going to call it society a clan, and most members of the clan are genetically related, which means that among hunter-gatherer clans, there really wasn't a distinction between society and the family. Family and the community are the same thing. You know, Hillary Clinton claims that it's an African proverb that it takes a village to raise a family, and conservative, I think it was Rick Santorum, rebutted that. He said, no, 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 no. It takes a, no, wait, no, wait, sorry, wait. Hillary Clinton said, the African proverb is, it takes a village to raise a child. And in response, a conservative, whom I think was Rick Santorum, said, no, it takes a family to raise a child. But actually, among hunter-gatherer clans, there wasn't a distinction. The village is the family, and not a metaphorical family. Literally the family, they're all genetically related. Okay, so that's very important. That's a very important point. It relates to many other points. So, okay, so they're all genetically related. So you might wonder, and basically, also they're all at war against each other. Each clans were normally at war against each other. Because of a Malthusian population crisis. Now, I'm a free marketer, so normally if you come at me and say, well, Malthusian population crises are a real thing, in the context where that's normally brought up, I'm very doubtful. Like in the 1970s, Paul Ralph Ehrlich and many other environmentalists, including Garrett Hardin, they would say that capitalist society, well, maybe not as much Garrett Hardin, because he made concessions to capitalism. Not as much as he should have, but he made some concessions. Well, but Paul Ralph Ehrlich said that, well, you know, in our wasteful capitalist society, we're depleting all the resources, we're depleting all these non-renewable natural resources, and we're going to go extinct, and therefore we need to, in order to stop that, we need to be more collectivist. We need to have more big government control, suppressing the individual consumption and individual production. You know, we need to impose more collectivism. We need to impose more government control, and this will stop Malthusian resource depletion. You know, and of course, he was wrong. Actually, it's freedom that allows you to get around that problem. It's freedom that allows entrepreneurs to find new methods of extracting greater and greater value of ever smaller and ever fewer inputs of resources. That includes labor and time and units of non-renewable natural resources. So we get more and more value per unit of materials produced when the natural resources that went into producing, when the quantities of natural resources, non-renewable natural resources that are inputted into the unit produced, the inputs get smaller and smaller, even as the economic value from the unit produced stays the same or gets larger. That's another video for another time. But anyway, so actually, Paul Ralph Ehrlich was wrong, doubly wrong, because he said that capitalist free society, market economies exacerbate the Malthusian resource depletion, and the solution is more collectivism and more government control over the people. Actually, the opposite is true. What people do succumb to Malthusian resource depletion, it is when they're more collectivist. It's when an individual isn't able to keep the fruit of his or her labor, thereby reducing the incentives for innovation, thereby reducing the incentives for finding more efficient methods of production. So it's actually in collectivist societies, just communist societies, that are more vulnerable to resource depletion and overpopulation, where there's not enough wealth per person. And you see that in communism, and pre-industrial hunter-gatherer clans are no exception. And it's very trendy for people like Jared Diamond to say that farming, people getting food mostly from farming, was so evil. Calls, quote, the worst mistake in the history of mankind, unquote. That's very trendy for people to say that. But no, really, I think our civilization, our species would be worse off if we didn't have sedentarism established, if we didn't establish agriculture. It's actually the hunter-gatherer collectivism that is unsustainable in the long run. Hunter-gatherers are running into problems with it, and that's exactly why they eventually had to switch to farming as their main source of food. And there are hunter-gatherer clans still existing today, but you notice how vulnerable they are exactly because they haven't made that change. But anyway, hunter-gatherer clans do deplete resources. What happens is they inhabit one area and strip all the flora and fauna until they can't get any more out of it, and then they have to move to somewhere else. They're nomads. So eventually, more there are hunter-gatherer clans, more they would fight over territory and natural resources, and that's what they did. So they were frequently at war. Now, they did eventually learn to trade with each other, and they did have methods of cooperation. But it's not just because they recognize, not necessarily because they recognize on their own the cooperation is so good. It usually happened this way. Usually, what happened was, let's say we have Clan A and Clan B are always fighting against each other. Eventually, Clan B also gets in conflict with Clan C. See, so both Clan A and Clan C are at war against Clan B. Eventually, there can come a point where Clan A and Clan C form an alliance, and they start trading with each other. So you could say that's cooperation, but notice that the cooperation between two societies is born of a mutual hatred for Clan B, whom they think is they're united against their greater enemy. And even when Clan A and Clan C form an alliance, and start trading, it doesn't necessarily mean the people from the other clans approve of each other. The idea is that you're very personal with people inside of your own clan, and you're very impersonal toward people outside of your clan. So if you're in Clan A, you're very personal. You have very personal knowledge with everyone else in Clan A. You deal with them on a personal basis. But when you form an alliance with Clan C and start trading with Clan C, you're very impersonal toward people in Clan C. So, but anyway, the general climate was that the clans were at war against each other for resources, and many evolutionary psychologists believe that this is how the idea, the us versus them mentality came about, where the us versus them mentality is you are really strongly in favor of your own in-group. You get your identity, try to get your own identity from the in-group, being in the in-group, and you think the in-group is so great, but what about people outside of the in-group? Well, they're not so great. Okay, at best, you treat them indifferently, such as Clan A is toward Clan C, or you outright, at best, you're indifferent toward them. At worst, you hate them and want to destroy them, just as Clan A hates Clan B and wants to destroy Clan B. And I guess in evolutionary psychologists, some of them think that this might be inborn because remember now, in our modern times, we've been living in these highly industrialized, republics for only about, say, 300 years, right? Well, when I say so I'm going to talk about liberal republicanism. when I say liberal, I mean I don't mean being a Democrat and in favor of the welfare state and being politically correct, you know, like Al Gore and President Obama. No, that's not what I mean by liberal in this context. I mean how the word liberal was originally used, meaning for limited government, more having a more laissez-faire free market economy, more like John Locke's philosophy, more capitalist. And when I say Republican, I don't mean the GOP. I mean Republican with a lowercase r, referring to republic. If you're a Republican in this context, it means you are in favor of living in a republic. You have a representative government where you're not the property of a monarch or any of that. You're your own person. And when it comes to public matters, like the common defense against foreign invaders, you know, that's when you rely on a representative government. Okay, so we've only had the modern institutions of liberal republicanism for the past 300 years or so. I wouldn't say more than 500 years, but by contrast, the hunter-gatherer way of living was went on for tens of thousands of years at the least. Okay, so it makes sense that adaptation, the way people had to adapt to hunter-gatherer life, you know, those genes are much longer lasting and more enduring. You know, those things are much, insofar as hunter-gatherer life might have influenced your genetic predisposition towards certain emotions or certain mentalities or attitudes, you would have had more time to develop that. I mean, a hunter-gatherer, I mean, to the degree that an environment shaped, let's say a hunter-gatherer Stone Age environment shapes its people to have some genetically inborn predispositions, emotional predispositions towards some ways of thinking. Let's say our modern way of life, liberal, republican, industrialized, also influences our genes and our emotional predispositions. And that, if that's the case, if both can influence our genes and those genes can influence our emotional predispositions and our attitudes, the hunter-gatherer way of living would have had much more time to produce enduring genes that influence our emotions and attitudes and way of seeing things than would our liberal republican way of seeing things. So that's why, even though we have a modern liberal republican environment, sometimes we can still have sort of a caveman mentality about things. So I think that's why even in our modern environment, people can still have an emotional predisposition towards sort of us versus them mentality. But that doesn't actually refute my individualist point of view. I have to explain that later. But basically, just because something is the default, even if having that sort of attitude is the default, it doesn't mean that that's destiny. It doesn't mean you have to be that way, because we also have a mind, a sapient, conscious mind that introspects and where we evaluate ourselves. So even if I have a visceral reaction, so even if it's my default to have sort of an us versus them mentality, it doesn't follow I have to act on it. You know, just as like if I have a visceral reaction, like if I see someone who's morbidly obese, my visceral reaction is go, oh, you know, I say something rude, even if that's my default, it doesn't mean I'm programmed to act on it. Okay, I have a conscious mind, and I think, no, I care about etiquette, and I know that just going, oh, to people doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help me. So yeah, I guess I would say that what's automatic and programmed is sometimes we have a visceral emotional reaction to specific stimuli that is programmed, or what our conscious long-term decisions, what we do about it, what we choose to do about our whims. So our whims are automatic; those are programmed. Our visceral reactions are programmed. But what we do in the long term, the conscious choices we make in response to our emotions, that is not programmed, that is not genetically predetermined, and that's the rational side, and I would say individualistic side as well. So but anyway, so people do have us versus them mentality, and I would argue that cavemen, even though those emergent sapiens in hunter-gatherers, the sapiens was they're sapient organisms and they're becoming more sapient. Even though that element is there, I would say that much more so than among humans, hunter-gatherers were more prone to go by their whims, their visceral reaction. So in this case, if their default position was to have an us versus them mentality, they'll go with that. Although there's another way, and this relates to gene culture coevolution. Even if that's not the default, in the hunter-gatherer environment, having collectivist mentality can be conditioned. It can be taught. Okay, so it would go like this. Okay, so this is how gene culture coevolution would work with ancient societies, pre-industrial societies like the hunter-gatherers. Often they developed specific customs, and often they didn't have a good conscious reason for it. Like they would just say, "Well, this is our taboo. This is our rule because the spirit said so." There are no spirits. It's arbitrary. But even though the origin of the custom is arbitrary, whether or not they follow that custom still could determine which clans propagate their genes and in turn propagate those customs, and which ones ended up being dead ends and just dying off and not being able to propagate anything. Like the anthropologist Marvin Harris talks about this taboo against eating pork among Middle Eastern people, among Orthodox Jews, among Muslims. What's so bad about eating pork? In the modern industrial world where we have modern sanitation, I think that if you're Jewish or Muslim and you eat pork in the United States or a modern country, I don't think that one time you eat pork is going to endanger you. So where did this whole custom come from? Why does it persist for so long? So the anthropologist Marvin Harris has an explanation for that. And it shows gene culture coevolution in action. So it goes like this. Let's say we have two clans in the Middle East. And for one is pork eating clan and anti-pork clan. And anti-pork clan develops this taboo against eating pork for a very arbitrary reason. They say, well, we can't eat pork because the spirits say so. And so if you're caught raising pork, we're going to kill you. Now that's pretty horrible, but just go with this, okay? So there's several reasons why in their pre-industrial environment, before modern sanitation, before modern medicine, there'd be disadvantages to them eating pork. For example, it could be that a virus is in the pigs and it's in the pork meat, and so with pork eating clan, eats all the pork, they get poisoned, then lots of them die, and maybe if there are survivors, there aren't enough of them to have their own kids. If they did have kids, they would raise their kids also to eat pork. But since there are fewer and fewer of them, they die, and that's a dead end. There comes a point where pork eating clan stops having kids. Since they stop having kids, they're not going to propagate their pork eating custom to future generations. Now let's say we have anti-pork clan. Well, if there's a sanitation problem with pigs, well, they're not going to face it because they don't eat pigs. Therefore, they survive. They spread their genes, and when they have their kids, they teach their kids also the anti-pork taboo. So the anti-pork taboo spreads from generation to generation. So this idea that maybe sanitation was the reason why Eventually, the clans that didn't eat pork were the clans that perpetuated customs. Marvin Harris is skeptical of that. He says it has more. He thinks it has more to do with something else. He thinks it has to do with. He thinks it has to do with just the resources that were around these clans. Where he said that hog farming just took up too many resources. There came a point where the output you would get from raising hogs was provide you less utility than all the inputs you put in. What you got out of it was less than what you had put into it, because that raising hogs was just that difficult in that environment. So it would go in his model. It goes more like this: working clan raises hogs to eat, but in so doing, they deplete too many resources. There's not enough to survive, so too many of them die off because too many of these guys died. They're not going to have kids, and they can't teach the pork eating custom to their future generations. So that's discontinued. By contrast, very arbitrary reasons. They say anti-pork clan says no, can't eat pork because God says no. Well, what happens is they don't devote all their resources to raising hogs. They devote all their resources to other things. It's enough for them to have enough kids, or that survive, and then they teach their kids the anti-pork taboo. See, so you see how in that environment, the custom of avoiding in that environment, both geographic, related to the geographic environment, both the geographic environment and the social environment encourage the custom of avoiding pork. So the custom of avoiding pork in that circumstance wouldn't just help some clans propagate their genes. The custom of avoiding pork perpetuates itself because it helps people perpetuate their genes. Those people have kids, and then they teach the anti-pork custom to their kids. So the custom itself is perpetuated. That's why it's an evolutionary adaptation. That's why customs undergo their own process of survival of the fittest. The customs which help the clans survive and have kids and raise their kids to adulthood. Insofar as the custom helps a clan accomplish that, the custom itself will be transmitted from one generation to the next. But note that those customs can become obsolete when the environment changes. We live in a modern industrial environment. I keep saying I'm going to get to that, and I will. We live in a modern industrial environment. We have modern medicine, modern sanitation. We have better methods of sanitation. So if pigs spread disease, it's not as big a problem with us as it was with those ancient clans. Moreover, what about resources? Many Malthusian environmentalist types like Paul Ehrlich will tell you, our agricultural system is so barren, it's so evil. Actually, it's more efficient than modern ancient methods. We can produce more output, more crops, more meat on less land, using fewer and smaller inputs of resources, including water. And if you doubt me, you can check with economists like Julian Simon, like Peter Diamandis, or you can check with Ray Kurzweil. You can check with Václav Smil. Václav Smil is more pessimistic than I am. He does make concessions to Malthusian resource Paul Ralph Ehrlich types, but he also admits that in many cases he does admit, yes, we're more efficient now. And then we can produce more units, even though smaller and fewer inputs of natural resources, non-renewable natural resources are going into that unit. So he doesn't want to admit we can sustain that. He thinks maybe there might come a time when the disaster will still strike. Basically, the evidence is on the side that we're more resourceful now. So just because the anti-pork taboo might have helped people, um, survive and have kids and have grandkids, just because that might help them in their ancient time with their more primitive technology, doesn't follow that it's advantageous for us in our time with our different environment, with our more sophisticated technology. See, so those ancient, sometimes custom could have helped people in gene culture coevolution back then, but the custom is obsolete at best and counterproductive at worst. So that's why I mean that's what I meant when I said earlier that just because an adaptation or a custom or folk way, just because it might help people in kin selection in ancient times, it doesn't mean we have to be that way now. So like just because sexual jealousy might have helped some caveman ensure that in his environment, his wife would give birth to his kids and not someone else's kids. Just because that might have helped people spread their genes back then, it doesn't mean we have to be controlled by sexual jealousy in our present environment, our present much richer environment, not just like culturally richer. I mean, literally richer in terms of material of our richer in our ability to extract value and a higher standard of living out of the resources around us. So that's gene culture coevolution. So, but anyway, so evolutionary psychologists often argue that through the process of gene culture coevolution, there are some ways the Stone Age environment could have incentivized collectivism in Stone Age tribes, Stone Age clans, and what is often called altruism. And both what Ayn Rand means by it, the self-sacrificial type, the type that demands your sacrifice, and also also things that are in your self-interest that help other people that objectivists would not call altruistic, like engaging in trade and commerce, bartering things. Like a lot of evolutionary psychologists think that bartering is altruistic, but objectivists would not say bartering stuff for your own self-interest is altruistic. But anyway, but it goes like this. So first of all, if let's say for argument's sake that it's not enough for people to be emotionally predisposed toward favoring their own clan above, everyone outside of the clan. Maybe you need something else. Maybe you need another influence. Maybe you need a cultural influence. Maybe you need the older generation trying to tell you that you ought to prioritize your clan above everyone else, above people outside your clan, and above yourself too. The clan is the unit that matters, not the individual, not you, not someone outside of the clan you might like. No, it's the clan. What cultural influences would there be? Well, first of all, there is the actual circumstance of always being at war. So, theory is that when your society is at war, that encourages collectivism of people within that society. Like if we're at peace and we're not at war against anyone else, we have a live and let live attitude. We might have a more live and let live attitude toward people in other cultures, other societies. But what if our society is under attack by a foreign culture? And we all have to rally together to fight that other culture in war. If that's the case, that will incentivize an us versus them mentality where we're like, yeah, our culture is so great. We have to emphasize the greatness of our own culture. And then the collective culture, this culture, this sort of jingoism, this attitude of my in-group is best, that will be encouraged. So that's one. So very fact that all these if these hunter-gatherer clans are at war, the very fact that they are at war can teach them through conditioning to be more collectivist. And another aspect of it is another thing is well, Randy Thornhill and some other Canadians. There's Fisher, Randy Thornhill, and Fisher. They these evolutionary psychologists in Canada have another theory of what could make some societies more collectivist, and it involves gene culture coevolution, and it goes this way. Let's say you have two clans, enterprising clan and xenophobic clan. Enterprising clan has sort of a live and let live attitude. They're like, yeah, we're going to deal with other people from outside other clans. We're going to be very open with them. You know, we're going to trade with them. We're not going to fear them. And let's say xenophobic clan is like well, they're xenophobic. They're going to close themselves off. They distrust everyone else. They want to minimize contact with other clans. They don't want to trade with them. You know, they're very insular. They're very insular. What's going to happen is normally in our modern environment, in our modern industrial liberal Republican environment, I think the enterprising open approach is good. You know, I don't want the United States closed off from outsiders or any of that. But the Randy Thornhill et al. Say in the Stone Age environment, things are different. You see, you know, because they don't have knowledge about disease, they don't understand it very well. They don't have a scientific, not like ours, they don't have a scientific understanding of pathogens and communicable diseases. So basically, what happened is if you're an enterprising clan and you have lots of intercourse with other clans, you know, intercourse, sexual or otherwise, what happens is you can get a pathogen, and people in enterprising clan are killed by the pathogen. So if too many of them die, they can't have kids, and they're not going to teach their enterprising ways to the next generation. That's a dead end. So by contrast, let's look at xenophobic clan. Well, they avoid contact with other outside peoples, and as a consequence, they're much less exposed to these diseases. So they survive, they have kids, and in their kids they teach their xenophobic ways. And Randy Thornhill did run a test on this. He said, if this hypothesis is true, then maybe we should look at the genetic histories of people. That is, we should look at all these different cultures and rate them according to how enterprising and open they are versus how xenophobic they are. Okay, so we're going to rank them according to how enterprising they are on one end of the spectrum, and how xenophobic they are on the other end of the spectrum. And they said, if our hypothesis is correct, then the clans that are most xenophobic, maybe what happened is clans that are xenophobic, they will have, you should find at some point in their history, they got a disease, a pathogen that spread and ravaged their society, and it was thereafter that their society became more xenophobic. So I think they looked into the histories of these different societies and did find a correlation where more xenophobic, when cultures were more xenophobic, they did find that there was some point in their history where they had a big plague or communicable disease, and thereafter they were much more xenophobic. So again, that's what I want to point out, the difference between the Stone Age environment and our modern environment. You know, just because we have more knowledge about disease, we have more knowledge about vaccination, we have more knowledge, you know, we have more resources for dealing with this. But just because maybe being open and enterprising and open to outsiders was more maybe that was riskier back in Stone Age, doesn't follow that it is exactly as risky in our own time. And since I keep pointing out how things are different between then and now, in the second part, I do want to explain how it's actually the individualist element, the more Ayn Randian element, that actually changed things so that we don't face the same dangers, same circumstances as collectivist Stone Age hunter-gatherers. But anyway, the point is that collectivism. To the degree that Stone Age clans were collectivist, that could be a manifestation of gene culture coevolution, where under the circumstances that they were under, the clans that were more collectivist were the ones that survived and propagated their genes, and so doing taught their kids their own collectivist ways. And the economist Samuel Bowles talks about this. Remember, their clans are at war, and they really do suffer from a Malthusian resource crisis, and as a consequence of that, they're often at war. So, economist Samuel Bowles, B-O-W-L-E-S, has this argument. He's retired from the university now. I think he's currently, as I say this, he's at the Santa Fe Institute, and that's an institution that talks about emergent complexity, something else my book series talks about. But he says, okay, it's like this. Someone's willingness to sacrifice himself, to die in war, to some degree, on some level, to the degree to which you are willing to sacrifice yourself in war for the rest of your clan, can help your clan win the war. And if your clan wins the war, if your clan is able to win the war and lay claim to the other guy's resources, the other guy's territory, then your clan will perpetuate itself, or it will have kids, and then you teach your collectivism to the kids, and then they teach it to their kids. Okay, so he says, in order for you to be able to do that, you have to win the war, and to a large extent, more people are going to die in battle, the more likely they are to win the war. But of course, there's a limit to that. If everyone in your society was self-sacrificial, everyone just killed themselves for the good of the planet, it wouldn't work. You need some people who are self-preserving, who are more selfish. So the idea is that maybe like being self-sacrificial for your society, your family, maybe that's recessive. Maybe it's a recessive gene. You need a gene like that from both parents, and it's recessive in order for you to be genetically predisposed or be willing to sacrifice yourself for a society. Okay, so not everyone in your society should be self-sacrificial. But Samuel Bowles' theory is that if a minority of people in your society is self-sacrificial, that can benefit everyone else in society, at least as far as Stone Age hunter-gatherers at war are concerned. And he makes this calculation. He says that there's a diminishing return. That is, for every one person, at first, for every one soldier in your hunter-gatherer clan who's willing to die, who actually dies in warfare for the benefit of the clan, for every one person who is willing to risk his life in war, it increases the likelihood of that clan winning in war until you reach some threshold. He says about 13%, like 133 people per 1,000. So if your clan is of 1,000 people, in real life, the clans are usually about 150 to 250 people. So, but anyway, if for every one person willing to die in war, risk his life to die in war, your clan, the likelihood of your clan winning the war increases until you reach 13%. Let's say 13% of the people, 13% of your soldiers die, whoever, 13% of the people in your society die, in battle. After that point, there's a diminishing return for every one person sacrificed in war. After you reach 13% mark, for every additional person dying in war reduces the chances of the clan winning the war and being able to perpetuate itself, with the resources won in battle. So, but anyway, but that's how Stone Age environment can encourage collectivism. This notion that someone willing to sacrifice his own material benefit, his own happiness, even his own life, for other people in society, that is better than the idea is that. So the idea is that someone willing to sacrifice his happiness, his wealth, his life for other people in society, that is being more admirable than someone peaceably minding his own business, leaving people alone, seeking his own self-interest. That idea being the norm, moral, normative idea of the conventional idea of morality in society, that is how that can be reinforced in the Stone Age environment. I should mention also the issues about, since I said that everyone in the clan is genetically related, you might be wondering about incest. Like, if everyone in the clan is genetically related and the clan is so insular and keeps having sex, aren't they going to be too incestuous? And that won't that be a disadvantage? The Stone Age hunter-gatherers did have a way around this. They didn't consciously think, yeah, incest is bad. Well, they did think incest was bad. They don't think, yeah, incest is bad because we have to spread our genes and cousins across, next generations. They didn't think that way. They had different reasons for doing what they did, which as a side effect mitigated against problems having to do with incest. But I should explain what is the real problem with incest. People think that incest is bad because if siblings, people who are related, have children, the children will be deformed. Actually, scientists find that incest doesn't cause deformity. I mean, not incest per se. If you have like two siblings who have genes that cause them to be deformed, and then they have sex and they have a kid who's deformed, the deformity wasn't caused by the incest per se. It was caused because each parent had a gene that made the deformity more likely. Incest is disadvantageous for another reason. It has to do with genetic diversity, and it has to do with diseases. Basically, let's say in the Stone Age environment, we have two hunter-gatherer clans again. Incestuous clan and anti-incestuous clan. Incestuous clan, they don't have a problem with incest, they do it. And anti-incestuous clan, they have a taboo against incest. They threaten to kill you if you commit incest, but they don't have a good scientific reason. They just say, well, if you have if people commit incest, then it will make the forest spirits angry, and we don't want the forest spirits angry. So so incest is immoral, and if you have incest, we're going to kill you. That's not a good reason, but okay. Here's what happens. Basically, what happens is that incestuous clan is more vulnerable to disease, like communicable diseases. So they're all genetically similar to each other because they're all related. So what happens is if a pathogen reaches one person, in the clan, because everyone in the clan is genetically similar to that one person, probably if that one person isn't immune to the disease, then the other people in the clan won't be immune to it either, and the disease spreads and they all die. And if they all die and they can't have kids, they're not going to be able to spread their pro-incest customs to future generations. That's why that was a dead end. By contrast, let's say we have now we have anti-incest clan. So for very irrational, arbitrary reasons, they say, yeah, we can't have, we're going to prohibit incest because forest spirits don't like that. What happens is they're less incestuous, they're more genetically diverse. So if the disease, communicable disease gets one person, that might kill that one person, but it won't necessarily kill everyone in the clan, because there might be people who are genetically different and they're immune to the disease. So even if the disease gets lost of the people in anti-incest clan, there might be enough of them who survive, and if they survive and have kids, they're going to teach them the anti-incest taboo. They're going to teach them, yeah, you can't have incest because the forest spirits don't like that. So you might wonder how anti-incest clan got to be more genetically diverse. There are several methods. Oh, I should mention, this is another example of gene culture coevolution, where the custom of being anti-incest wasn't necessarily genetically predetermined, but it did influence which people do get to have kids and grandkids, and which people do not. Which people do get to spread their genes, and which people do not. And the custom, the non-genetically predetermined custom that does help people spread their genes is the custom itself that gets spread from one generation to the next, as long as the circumstances remain the same. But you know that some evolutionary psychologists argue that there actually, in compounding that, there actually might be a genetically predetermined inborn aversion to incest. You know, and they say that it has to do with what happens is that if you raise two kids together, like if you raise kids, you raise them together, they're being raised together somehow from some inborn mechanism that we don't understand very well. For some inborn mechanism, they won't have sex when they grow up. It doesn't matter if they're related or not related. But although this is a consequence of this is more relevant. Well, the idea is that if you raise two kids, they're not genetically related, or you raise them together and they've known each other all their whole lives, even though they're not genetically related, and they probably won't have sex. The idea of them having sex is just viscerally, innately disgusting to them. You don't have to tell them that, oh, you don't have to tell them this stuff about, incest produces deformities or any of that. They just won't do it. By contrast, if you there are stories about how sometimes you have like long lost relatives who were raised apart, like a long lost brother or sister, or like a mother who gave up her baby, and then didn't see the enemy. And these people, long lost relatives, weren't reunited until later when they were adults. Psychologists find that a lot of times when these people who are meeting each other, these relatives who meet each other for the first time as adults, when they finally meet, they do have a sexual attraction to each other. That happens. It happens with siblings, and the psychologists think it's because they weren't raised together. If they were raised together, somehow something in their makeup, their physiology would cause them not want to have sex with each other. And they think that that's absent if they're not raised together. But if that is inborn, again, the idea is that if you have two clans, again, incestuous clan and anti-incest clan. Incestuous clan, they don't have that in their genes. Don't give them this aversion to incest. So you raise two kids together, and they grow up, and there's no inborn mechanism stopping them from having sex, so they do have sex. And again, they're all genetically, everyone in the clan is too genetically similar, so if one person is vulnerable to a pathogen, they all are. By contrast, if an anti-incest clan, if some mutation, inborn mutation is in them that causes them to avoid incest, because if you raise two siblings together, they're averse to the idea of having sex as adults. If that's inborn, well, they won't commit incest, and they're going to be anti-incest, and they'll be more genetically diverse. Now I have to explain how the more diverse, genetically diverse clan gets to be more genetically diverse, since most people in the clan are related. So there are ways to get around that. Again, I talked about alliance. This has to do with alliances. So Clan A and Clan C were both at war against Clan B. And as a consequence of the mutual hatred for Clan B, eventually Clan A and Clan C form an alliance, and they become closer together. They don't necessarily trust each other, but at least not in the beginning. They don't trust each other. But eventually they trade with each other, they cooperate with each other more. And sometimes they don't just trade in goods. Sometimes when clans trade with each other, the high-ranking people in the clan, the high-ranking men in the clan, most clans are patriarchal. Sorry, it's politically incorrect, but that's how they are. Most clans are patriarchal. Matriarchal clans do exist, but they're the minority. And when two clans would trade with each other, the high-ranking men would outright trade wives. They would swap wives and say, "Okay, you can have sex with my wife now." They did that. Not all of them, but it wasn't completely unheard of. It wasn't uncommon. I don't mean to say all clans are like that. There's variation. And again, a lot of the variations and customs have to do with them coming in different environments. Some are in tropical environments. Like some people are in tropical environments. You're talking about Athapascans in North America. In very cold environments, they do things a bit differently because they're in a different geographic environment, a different climate, all those things. But the point is that among hunter-gatherer clans, there were cases of Clan A and Clan C trading spouses, and if they did that, that encouraged genetic diversity. And of course, encouraging genetic diversity wasn't their goal. That was just a side effect. And there's another way they did it too. Let's say Clan A and Clan C finally win the war against Clan B. They finally destroy the patriarchs running Clan B. Now they can take Clan B's territory. One of the spoils of war is that the men from the victorious clan, sometimes they would just outright take women from Clan B and force them into marriage and rape them and force those women to have their children. And that's very horrible. It's very barbaric. But sometimes it happens. I mean, that's even mentioned in the Old Testament, where there are verses, I think in Leviticus or Deuteronomy. I could be mistaken, but I think there are testaments. There are verses in the Old Testament within the first 5 books that say where Moses said, someone like Moses or someone else says, "Yeah, take over kill those other clans, kill the men, but keep the women and children for yourselves." That happened all over. It happened in the Americas. It happened in Europe, Africa, Asia, every inhabited continent. Things like that happened. And again, when evolutionary psychologists say those things happen, they don't mean, just because cavemen did it, that's good. We should be like that now. Except in one area, they think that just because Stone Age hunter-gatherer clans were altruist and collectivist, it follows we should be altruist and collectivist, just not in the same mean sort of way. We shouldn't be so inhumane in our collectivism. We should still be collectivist and altruist, but more humane about it. I'll get to that later. But so that's how they do it. So you see, so even though the clans were mostly genetically related, but if they conquer other people and take their women, or if they swap sexual partners, or aligning clans swap sexual partners, they can maintain genetic diversity. And of course, there are examples of clans forming alliances and eventually merging into, a single society where Clan A and Clan C can merge into a new group, like a whole tribe. Tribe is a bigger unit than a clan, or they can become a village, a tribe. And anthropologists have more sophisticated ways of classifying them. So, but anyway, the point is that, so basically hunter-gatherer clans were collectivist, and there are two theoretical ways that can happen, and they're not mutually exclusive. But basically, perhaps because of the circumstances they were under, selected for clans to be more under the circumstances they were under, naturally selected the clans that were more collectivist at the time. And that can be encouraged within the clan two ways. Perhaps theoretically, there is some inborn emotional predisposition of people to have an us versus them mentality, to side with their in-group above the out-group, and to look and to admire someone more for sacrificing himself to the clan than admiring someone who peaceably and benevolently serves his own self-interest. So maybe a part of that, maybe there's an emotional predisposition toward that. And again, that's not the exact same thing as destiny. Just because you have an emotional bias toward that doesn't mean your conscious mind will always agree with that and say, yeah, that's right. So even if we can see the evolutionary psychologist case there, it doesn't mean someone with that emotional bias, it doesn't preclude that person from where agreeing consciously with the Ayn Rand philosophy. And the other way that collectivism can be reinforced is, again, through conditioning, through that custom, through gene culture coevolution, where even if maybe you don't have a bias toward, maybe you're not emotionally predisposed toward collectivism, maybe you don't, it's not your default to think, yeah, someone who sacrifices himself for the clan is more worthier of my admiration than an entrepreneur who serves his own self-interest peaceably. Even if that isn't your default, you can be pressured into that by conditioning, where your parents, your uncles, and aunts, try to indoctrinate that with you incessantly. That's the case. That's another method whereby the collectivist ethos is instilled. Because remember, the collectivist ethos is a folkways. It supposedly helps hunter-gatherers adapt to their environment, and even it's spread from one generation to the next. Even if it's not inborn, even if we say, oh, it's only taught and not inborn, it's still an evolutionary adaptation, because supposedly it helped people adapt to that environment and it helped them have kids and grandkids, and then it spread from one generation to the next because they were taught. People were taught that. Oh, and that reminds me of how I should explain how that's kin selection. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. So no, this is kin selection. Okay. So how it applies to humans. The idea is that even if you don't have, as personally don't have children of your own, your unselfish behavior can help perpetuate your own genes from one generation to the next. Like let's say someone is gay, someone has a recessive combination of genes that make him or her gay. Or maybe he or she is born sterile. But the point is that the person doesn't have children. Well, let's say that person's siblings have children. The person's brother and sister have children, and that person helps raise, assists in raising those children, and those children grow up and have their own children. If that's the case, even though this person didn't have kids of his or her own, he or she helped spread genes, his own genes, one generation to the next, because genes that he shares with his siblings were transmitted from across generations. So that's gene culture coevolution. And no, I'm sorry, that's kin selection. And I should explain. Oh yeah, and that was very common actually. I should explain adoption and why it doesn't contradict kin selection when you help someone and you feel good about helping someone who's not genetically related to you. Okay, so kin selection. Okay, so adoption. Okay, so um, okay, so this notion that like only your father and mother raise you, and other people are not your parent. You're raised by your parents, but you don't think of your aunts and uncles as having the same authority over you as your parents, or you don't think of your English teacher as having the same authority over you as your parents do. Although maybe Melissa Harris Perry would like that. I don't agree with Melissa Harris Perry's politics, but her notion that you don't just belong to your parents, but you belong to everyone in society. Actually, that was very common among Stone Age hunter-gatherer clans. But of course, everyone in the hunter-gatherer clan was family anyway. But basically, the idea is that among hunter-gatherer clans, you're not just raised by your mother, you're raised by all the elders. All the elders are your parents. Your aunts and uncles help raise you. Like many hunter-gatherer clans, all the women can think of themselves as one big team, and they raise all the kids. And they don't think of and it's not like, oh well, this is my kid, and it's not like a woman thinks, oh, I gave birth to this one, but I didn't give birth to this one. I favor the one to whom I gave birth. They supposedly don't think that way. They don't make the distinction. And Sarah Blaffer Hardy calls that allo mothering. The notion that your own parent, notion that your parents have authority over you, but not all the other elders. That's a relatively recent idea. That's part of what I'm going to talk about of greater individualism. Okay, so but basically that's how adoption. No, wait. Perhaps I should explain it this way. Okay, I'm going to go with helping people who are not genetically related to you. So hunter-gatherers didn't make a distinction between family and society. Family and community are the same thing. Now, we only began to make a conscious distinction between family or the household and the rest of everyone else in our society when people became more sedentary, and then they used farming as their main method of food, like growing grains. I know lots of people who want to say grains. It was when people became sedentary and they started raising grains, and all the horror people started developing all these health problems. It's so evil. I don't agree with that. I mean, there were disadvantages to people making that switch. I recognize the disadvantages and I recognize the trade-offs, but on cost-benefit analysis, I think there was a net gain in making the switch. That might be another video for another time. But anyway, the point is that places like ancient Sumer, places like Mesoamerica, there were empires, and eventually they switched to agriculture being the main source of food. And when that happened, that's when they started building whole cities, and lots of people were living together, and society was much bigger now than 250 people. And when that happened, the things became different, because before, if your society is just 150 people, no bigger than 250 people, then anytime you deal with people in your society, the dealing is personal. Now, when you're in a farming society and you're in a whole city, it becomes different. Psychologist Robin Dunbar talked about this. He talks about Dunbar's number, where he says we still have caveman brains in some ways. So he says it's not realistic for you to be personal, to think of yourself as being in a very personal relationship with more than 250 people. He usually goes to 150. He says you can't. It's not realistic for you to be very personal toward people, more than 150 people. 250 is probably the limit. And he says after that point, that's when you begin to be very impersonal in your dealings with other people, even though they're in your society, they're in your in-group. Like maybe you live in New York City. You know, New York City, all New Yorkers might be your in-group, but because New York is so populous, you're just not going to be personal toward everyone you meet. You're going to be impersonal toward most of them. So what happened is, that's when people started becoming more individualistic. I have to touch on that, but basically, that's when we began to have smaller households, where because things are more impersonal now, you can't. Not everyone in the city is. If you're a child, not all the women in the city is your mother anymore. They don't all have the authority. This is the end of allo mothering. Now, basically, we have the household where people build houses where they're separate from each other and they have more privacy. And basically, the child is only raised by, for the most part, raised by his or her parents. You can still be raised by an extended family, like aunts and uncles and and such, but they're just exactly that extended. They're no longer, the aunts and uncles no longer have the same authority normally as your parents do. So it's more impersonal now. So on conscious level, people began to make a distinction between family, household, more nuclear family, versus their whole community. But notice that but they still inherited the caveman brain. They still inherited the emotional predispositions. So even if people in ancient Sumer consciously made a distinction on a cognitive level between family and community, they don't necessarily make that distinction on an emotional level, on a visceral level. And what these people inherited the genes that emotionally predispose them for caring about their community, because to their ancestors, community and family are the same. So therefore, they're now what they've inherited are genes that emotionally predispose them for helping just people, generally anyone generally the community as a whole, or other people from the community, which where the ancestors would have been genetic relatives, but now not necessarily so. But anyway, they're genetically predisposed toward helping their community, which would have been the family. And that's why people can still. So if there's an emotional benefit. So if cavemen could emotionally benefit from helping other people in their family, it follows that they had emotional benefit from helping anyone in their community. So if farming society, agrarian societies inherited the same genes for the same emotional predisposition, the emotions won't necessarily make that distinction between family and community. That's why Richard Dawkins says this, I think, in God Delusion. He says, so if these ancient Sumerians or other agrarian people who live in cities inherited genes from, if there's a gene that makes you feel good for helping people in your family, then that for people who live in large societies, that will translate to feeling good about helping other people in your community. And being generous toward other people is not actually self-sacrifice. This is an argument. The physicist Victor Stenger made this argument. He died recently, I think last year. But he makes an argument that goes like this. He says, let's say you have a general policy of being generous toward people. Maybe you're on the bus, you give up your seat to old ladies, even if there isn't a rule saying you have to do that. You give up your seat toward old people, wherever you're generous. And let's say you don't always get an obvious reward. Sometimes you're generous toward people and they're not nice back to you, and you're still keep the general policy of being generous most of the time anyway. What's going on here? Does this mean you're self-sacrificial? Well, Victor Stenger said no, it's not necessarily the case, because there's a cost-benefit analysis, because you don't necessarily make this calculation consciously. It can be on sort of a gut level, but the calculation goes, if you're generous most of the time, sometimes people will be nice back to you, and sometimes they won't. And the idea is that the gain, the emotional revenue you get people being generous back to you outweighs the cost of all the times that you're nice to people and they weren't nice back to you, they didn't reciprocate it. So basically, you can account for, there will be cases where if you're generous most of the time, people will not be nice back to you. They're going to take advantage of you, and that will be a cost to you. But those costs that are imposed that way are still outweighed by the benefits you get from people, all those other times where people reciprocate your kindness, or civility or politeness. And therefore, on a cost-benefit analysis, you still make a net profit in terms of happiness, good spirits, human flourishing. You still have a net profit in terms of that, eudaimonia, by pursuing a policy of being generous. And if that's the case, then you're being generous all the time isn't self-sacrificial. You don't have a net loss, even if there are many times when people take advantage of you and are not generous back to you. See, and Victor Stenger might have thought he was contradicting objectivism there, but his argument, I think, is consistent with objectivism and the Ayn Randian idea of rational, peaceful self-interest. So it doesn't preclude, being generous at all. Some people will say, well, that's sort of a cynical reason to be nice to people, but whatever, that's their problem. But anyway, so I explained how, and this is something the religious right guy Nesha Souza didn't understand. Like in his debate with Michael Shermer, he said, well, what if I give up my seat to someone on the subway and that person is not related to me? Doesn't that contradict kin selection? Doesn't that contradict evolution? Because why should natural selection incentivize my being nice to that person if that person is not related to me and doesn't share my genes? Richard Dawkins, he mentioned Richard Dawkins by name. He said Richard Dawkins has no explanation for that. And I think that goes to show he didn't carefully read all of the God Delusion, because the God Delusion did address that and did say what I said about how, on an emotional level, because Stone Age hunter-gatherers didn't make a conscious distinction between family and community, they never had to make that distinction. And because city dwellers inherited their genes, even if those city dwellers make a conscious cognitive distinction between family and community, they don't make that distinction, always have to make the distinction on an emotional level. So Nesha Souza was just plain wrong. He said Richard Dawkins didn't account for that. Well, now I want to explain adoption. Okay, so another argument goes, okay, so let's say you adopt children. They're not genetically related to you, but you can come to love them as if you did give birth to them, as if they are the product of your genes. And maybe we'll assume that kin selection doesn't account for that, but again, it does. And it goes back to the concept of allomothering and kin selection. And it goes like this. Let's say I have kids. I have brothers and sisters, and I have kids. And then I die in war. Well, what happens to my kids then? It's not like my siblings are going to say, well, I didn't give birth to them, therefore we're just going to leave them to die. No, remember, that's not how hunter-gatherers, that's not how they function. what will happen is that if I die and my siblings raise my children for me, that is going to, if my siblings do that, they are going to propagate their own genes, because when my brother and sister and stuff raise their nieces and nephews in my absence, those nieces and nephews share genes with them, so they propagate. So when people in the hunter-gatherer clan raise the kid, so when people in the hunter-gatherer clan raise other people's kids because the kids' parents died, they're still propagating their genes from one generation to the next. Remember, and they don't make a distinction between family and community. Anyone in the community is family. And you could say that this is a form of adoption. So it goes like this. So now we're city dwellers, right? And we don't live in small hunter-gatherer clans anymore. But we still have, but just as kin selection, people could the selfish gene under kin selection, in so many hunter-gatherer clans, the selfish gene was propagated from one generation to the next among clans where people could be in love, could have love for kids that weren't who weren't directly their kids. Okay, the idea is that if let's say if my sibling dies, someone else in the clan dies, and I raise that person's kids, if I don't care about that person's kids and neglectful, and that person and the kid dies before becoming an adult, that reduces the chances of my genes being passed on to the next generation. By contrast, if I have some selfish gene that gives me some impetus to care about any kid in my custody, if my genes predispose me for wanting to give affection toward any kid in my custody, then because that kid is likely related to me anyway, somehow, as a niece or nephew, that will help me spread my genes to the next generation, even if I myself never have kids of my own. Now how does this translate to modern society, where we raise kids, where people raise kids who are not obviously genetically related? Again, when people started living in cities, they cognitively made a distinction between family and community, but on an emotional level they didn't, because again, the hunter-gatherer period was tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years, whereas the agrarian period is relatively much shorter. Like, say, I think that the Sumerians were started about agriculture around 5000 BC or so. That's like a blip compared to all the time humans spent as hunter-gatherers before then. So when people became agrarian and began to live in big cities, it could be the case that people start to adopt children, and the children they didn't give birth to those children, they didn't sire those children directly, but because they inherited the hunter-gatherer's genes, and emotionally don't always have to make a distinction between family and community, they come to love this child in their community as their own. So that's how those counterexamples don't actually refute the theory of kin selection. So that's pretty long. Now, it's a pretty long explanation. So now I'm going to explain how this why kin selection doesn't refute the objectivist ethics. Why even if hunter-gatherer clans were collectivists, it doesn't follow, contrary to many evolutionary psychologists like Eric Michael Johnson and David Sloan, it doesn't follow, even if hunter-gatherer clans were collectivists, even if natural selection selected for them to have an emotional predisposition toward this. And even if modern people have inherited this emotional default, it doesn't follow that objectivist ethics are refuted. It doesn't follow that altruism is inherent in human nature, or that following a peaceable egoist path is contrary to human nature. But I've gone on for a very long time, and I'm very thirsty, and so I think I'm going to get a drink of water, and instead of continuing this video like that, I'm just going to stop it now, and I'm going to continue in another video. So, thanks for being patient with me, and don't go telling me that you're sacrificing your own interest for my benefit. If you stuck with me this long, I'm going to conclude that you got something out of it. You might have buyer's remorse and say, no, I watched the whole thing and it was boring, I shouldn't have done it. But well, I hope you got something out of it, and if you did get something out of it, it was your self-interest. And I'll continue in that vein in the next installment. Thank you.